They couldn't handle the truth. The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage and spoke her mind live on national television, you could feel the tension shift. What was supposed to be another neatly packaged daytime broadcast quickly spiraled into something much more dangerous. Dangerous for the network, for the agenda, and for those invested in maintaining the illusion of consensus. The mainstream media machine thrives on control. Control of the message, control of the tone, and, most importantly, control of the boundaries. But when someone breaks through that carefully constructed shell with raw, unfiltered truth, the system reacts like an exposed nerve. It was instantaneous. There was no room for discussion, no opportunity for counterpoints. Just panic. 1 minute, she's speaking directly to the American people. The next, everything is unraveling. Producers scrambling behind the scenes, co-hosts fidgeting nervously in their chairs, eyebrows raised, voices raised even higher. This wasn't just an off-script moment. This was a breach. Someone said something they weren't supposed to say on a platform that never expected it, and it sent a shockwave through the studio. You could tell they had expected a clash, sure. Conflict. Draws viewers, boosts ratings. But they didn't anticipate a full-blown rupture in the narrative. The media often invites dissenting voices under the illusion of openness, only to trap them in sound bites, scripted debates, or ambushes disguised as interviews. But when Karoline walked onto that stage, she didn't play by their rules. She didn't wait to be prompted. She didn't soften the blow or dilute the message. She went straight for the jugular of the media-industrial complex, and for a few electric minutes, she broke through the noise. And then they shut it down. Think about that. A live broadcast, cut short, not due to technical failure, not due to unforeseen events, but because someone expressed a viewpoint that directly challenged the foundation of what that show represents. That level of immediate censorship speaks volumes about the fragile nature of the narrative they're trying so hard to maintain. They don't fear falsehoods, they fear inconvenient truths. Because falsehoods can be mocked, debated, or dismissed. But the truth has weight. It's sharp. It cuts through distraction and forces people to confront what they've been avoiding. The chaos that followed wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The machine operates under the premise that people can't be trusted with too much truth. They prefer comfortable illusions, simple dichotomies, and neatly edited talking points. But when someone steps into their arena and speaks without a filter, without pre-approval, without fear, suddenly the script is useless. The media has to rely on control mechanisms, interruptions, outrage, mischaracterizations, or in this case, outright cancellation. And yet, in trying to erase the moment, they amplified it. Cutting the broadcast only confirmed everything that was said. Their reaction exposed the very intolerance they claimed to stand against. The panic, the desperation, the immediate silencing, it all revealed the undercurrent of fear that drives much of today's media culture. It's not about keeping viewers informed, it's about keeping them aligned. Dissent isn't welcome, it's dangerous. That's why this moment was so critical. It pierced the veil. For a fleeting instant, viewers weren't just watching a daytime TV spat. They were witnessing the system malfunction in real time. They saw the mask slip. And whether they agreed or disagreed with what was said, they couldn't unsee the way the media recoiled when confronted with something they didn't control. This wasn't just a guest going rogue. This was a pressure valve being blown open, under the weight of decades of deception, spin, and corporate curation. The people behind the cameras thought they could contain it, that by cutting the feed, issuing statements, or spinning the story later, they could put the genie back in the bottle. But truth doesn't work that way. Once it's out, it lingers. It spreads. It ignites conversations. It raises questions. And it forces people to reevaluate what they thought they knew. And no amount of spin, no matter how polished or rehearsed, can undo that spark. What happened on live television was not just another controversial moment. It was a masterclass in real-time censorship. The sequence unfolded so quickly that many viewers didn't even realize what they were witnessing until it was over. 1 minute, Karoline Leavitt was speaking with clarity and precision, delivering a message that directly challenged the carefully groomed narrative upheld by mainstream platforms. The next, the air was cut, The show abruptly redirected, and a wave of confusion rippled through the audience. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated shutdown, a visible demonstration of what happens when someone steps too far outside the ideological lines drawn by corporate media. Censorship is no longer cloaked behind subtle edits or post-show press releases. It's brazen now. It happens live in front of the camera, as producers scramble behind the scenes and the hosts scramble for control. What viewers witnessed wasn't just a disagreement or an uncomfortable exchange. It was the media's instinctive reaction to a threat they couldn't predict and couldn't control. The message that was being delivered in that moment struck too close to home. It poked at the unspoken truths that lie beneath the glossy surface of daytime television. That free speech is allowed, but only within a specific, approved framework. The decision to cut away wasn't technical, it was tactical. In an instant, the content was deemed too risky, too volatile, too real. And so, it had to be removed before it gained traction, before it resonated, before it spread. Because the true danger in moments like this isn't what is said, it's what might happen if too many people hear it, think about it, and begin to question everything they've been fed by those very same media institutions. When the segment was yanked, when the cameras stopped rolling on her, the message rang louder than ever. There are boundaries in place, and they are enforced with ruthless efficiency. It's not just about silencing one person, it's about signaling to everyone watching that certain ideas are off limits. The media doesn't just moderate the conversation anymore, they police it. They decide what qualifies as valid speech and what is too controversial, too disruptive, or too challenging to the status quo. That's the genius of live censorship. It disguises itself as a reaction to chaos, a safety measure to preserve decency, when in reality it's a suppression mechanism. And in that moment, it was activated like a reflex. The threat wasn't vulgarity, it wasn't misinformation, it was someone unapologetically telling the truth in a way that couldn't be edited, spun, or softened for public consumption. That kind of honesty is treated like a contagion in tightly controlled media environments. It spreads quickly, infects the narrative, and undermines the power structures that rely on compliance. The conversation that was happening before the cut wasn't filled with personal attacks or inflammatory language. It was simply bold, factual, and outside the bounds of what the producers had likely anticipated. That alone was enough to trigger a full shutdown. Not because they feared for the audience, but because they feared losing control over them. Control is the currency of media today. Control of tone, control of framing, control of how much truth is too much. This wasn't a moment of chaos. It was clarity. For anyone paying attention, the abrupt end to that segment wasn't just censorship. It was an unmistakable signal. It told the public everything they needed to know about who decides what gets aired, what gets suppressed, and how deeply uncomfortable the media becomes when someone refuses to play by their rules. There were no personal attacks involved, no hate speech, no violations of broadcast standards, just an opinion that cut through the noise and struck at the heart of the mainstream illusion. And rather than meet that moment with debate or dialogue, they opted for silence. Not because they didn't have a response, but because they couldn't afford to let the conversation continue. It's a form of narrative triage. Cut the feed, protect the brand, and hope the audience forgets what they saw. But they won't. Because censorship has a boomerang effect. The more visible it is, the more it confirms the suspicion that the system isn't built for open discourse. It's built to maintain a version of reality where only one side gets to speak freely, while Karoline Leavitt addressed a growing debate surrounding the legality of freezing federal funds that have already been appropriated by Congress, responding with a confident and direct affirmation that such action is not only lawful, but well within the executive branch's authority. She laid out a detailed justification grounded in legal precedent and existing statutory powers, aimed at dispelling concerns that the move amounted to an unconstitutional overreach. According to her, the executive has both the responsibility and the discretion to ensure that federal funds are used in a manner consistent with the law, national interest, and policy objectives. She explained that under the Anti-Deficiency Act and related budgetary statutes, the executive branch is permitted, indeed obligated, to halt spending when it determines that federal funds are being misused, wasted, or directed toward activities that conflict with statutory or constitutional principles. In this case, she argued the decision to suspend funding was based on credible evidence that certain recipients were acting contrary to U.S. immigration law and undermining enforcement efforts. The issue, as she framed it, is not whether the funds were previously allocated, but whether their disbursement serves the public good and adheres to legal standards. To bolster her argument, she cited guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which provided a formal opinion validating the freeze. According to this guidance, the executive branch has the right to conduct programmatic reviews of funding allocations and to pause or cancel disbursements if they are deemed to be in violation of administrative rules, national policy, or legislative intent. She also mentioned that the White House counsel's office had reviewed the action and determined it to be both constitutional and procedurally sound, further reinforcing the legitimacy of the move. One of the central points in her explanation was that federal agencies are not passive conduits for congressional appropriations. They are active stewards of public funds, entrusted with the duty to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not used in ways that contradict federal priorities or statutory restrictions. If an agency identifies misuse or a conflict between the recipient's actions and the law, it not only has the authority to intervene, it has a legal and ethical obligation to do so. She preemptively addressed the criticism that the freeze bypassed Congress, emphasizing that this was not an attempt to override legislative authority, but to uphold it. The funds in question, she explained, were earmarked for specific purposes and with the expectation that recipients would comply with all applicable laws. When those recipients failed to meet those conditions, the executive had every right to halt further disbursement until compliance could be assured. In that sense, the freeze was not a challenge to congressional power, but a reinforcement of it, ensuring that appropriations were used as Congress intended. Additionally, she pointed to legal precedent that supports the conditional nature of federal funding. Numerous Supreme Court decisions, she said, have affirmed the principle that federal funds can carry conditions and that those conditions must be met to receive or retain funding. If an organization fails to meet those terms, whether in relation to transparency, legality, or accountability, the government has the authority to withhold further support. Leavitt also emphasized the importance of timing and due process in executing the freeze. This was not a hasty or politically motivated action, she asserted, but the result of careful legal review and administrative vetting. Multiple departments were involved in evaluating the recipient's compliance with legal and ethical standards, and each case was assessed individually. This procedural rigor, she claimed, underscores the fact that the freeze was not a blanket action, but a targeted effort to uphold the integrity of public spending. She acknowledged that such decisions are never without controversy, but insisted that the alternative, continuing to fund entities engaged in legally questionable activities, was far worse. In her view, the government cannot turn a blind eye to misuse simply because money has already been set aside. Public trust depends on the responsible and lawful use of taxpayer dollars, and that requires ongoing oversight even after appropriations have been made. Her comments also signaled a broader intention to recalibrate the relationship between funding and accountability. Federal grants, she asserted, are not entitlements. They are contracts, bound by expectations and obligations. When those obligations are not met, the government must act. In her words, withholding funds is not an act of aggression or partisanship. It is a reaffirmation of the rule of law. The priority is not just fiscal discipline, but the protection of democratic processes and public interest. The message was clear. Compliance with the law is not optional, and funding cannot continue in its absence. Karoline Leavitt addressed a contentious issue in her speech regarding the recent dismissal of several inspectors general, a decision that drew sharp criticism from various political and media circles. She defended the action as a lawful and deliberate exercise of executive discretion, pushing back strongly against allegations that the firings were politically motivated or conducted without proper notice. Her defense was not couched in vague generalities, but supported by references to legal standards and historical precedent, which she claimed justified the move and placed it well within the bounds of constitutional authority. According to Leavitt, the dismissals were carried out in full compliance with the applicable laws governing the oversight and removal of inspectors general. Contrary to accusations that the decision violated statutory obligations, she asserted that the required notification procedures had been followed, including communication with relevant congressional committees. While she acknowledged that some individuals had been removed before the expiration of the customary 30-day notice period, she explained that those decisions were made based on urgent circumstances that demanded immediate action. National security, internal misconduct, or a loss of confidence in impartiality were among the reasons she cited for the accelerated timeline. Leavitt took time to push back against what she described as a politically charged narrative aimed at undermining the administration's credibility. She made it clear that inspectors general, while independent, are not immune from accountability and are not above reproach. When these officials fail to perform their duties in an impartial or effective manner, or when they overstep their bounds, it is the responsibility of the executive to intervene. In her view, retaining individuals in such critical oversight roles, despite concerns about their conduct or objectivity, poses a greater risk to government integrity than their removal. She emphasized that the executive branch holds constitutional authority to appoint and remove officers who serve under its direction, including inspectors general. While Congress has a role in the oversight process, it cannot override the president's authority to dismiss officials who no longer serve the public interest or align with lawful policy execution. The Inspectors General Act, she explained, allows for removal provided that Congress is notified and that a reason is offered, which she claimed had occurred in each case. Addressing the broader public reaction, she argued that the media and political opponents had distorted the situation, framing the removals as part of a pattern of authoritarianism or revenge politics. She characterized these portrayals as not only inaccurate but dangerous, undermining public trust in the legal mechanisms that guide personnel decisions within the federal government. In her words, what was being misrepresented as a political purge was in fact a straightforward instance of leadership accountability. Leavitt pointed out that numerous presidents in past administrations had removed inspectors general under similar circumstances, often without the degree of scrutiny currently being applied. She mentioned historical examples where such actions were taken without controversy, suggesting that the outrage in this instance was less about the removals themselves and more about political theater. Her tone in this segment was sharp and unapologetic, making it clear that the administration would not be deterred by media backlash or partisan attacks. She also spoke to the functional implications of keeping ineffective or biased inspectors general in place. These officials are tasked with uncovering fraud, waste, and abuse. But when they become compromised, complacent, or politically entangled, they undermine the very oversight they are meant to uphold. According to her, continuing to fund or support such individuals does not protect transparency, it weakens it. The dismissals, she argued, were necessary to restore the credibility and efficiency of the offices involved. To ensure continued accountability, Leavitt noted that new nominations for inspector general positions would undergo rigorous vetting to guarantee impartiality, competence, and commitment to lawful oversight. This, she claimed, would reinforce, not diminish, the integrity of the government's internal watchdog system. In her remarks, she made it clear that the goal was not to eliminate scrutiny, but to ensure that it is exercised responsibly and without bias. She concluded the section by reiterating that these actions were not about silencing dissent, but about ensuring that the federal bureaucracy operates within the limits of law and professionalism. The inspectors general, while important, do not exist in a vacuum. They must operate with the same level of accountability they demand from others. In this view, the decision to remove those who fell short of these standards was not only lawful but necessary for the health of the executive branch and its ability to serve the public effectively. Karoline Leavitt closed her speech with a tone of unshakable resolve, tying together the themes of lawfulness, accountability, and national interest that had defined her earlier points. Her final remarks were crafted to project confidence and purpose, casting the administration's decisions not as reactive measures but as deliberate and necessary reforms aimed at restoring order, sovereignty, and integrity to the federal government. She framed the actions taken, whether related to defunding NGOs, strengthening visa vetting, freezing federal funds, or removing inspectors general, as part of a broader commitment to uphold the rule of law in every corner of government. These weren't isolated policy shifts, she argued, but interconnected components of a comprehensive strategy to protect the American people, reinforce the nation's institutions, and realign federal power with the Constitution. Each measure, in her view, addressed an area that had been neglected or abused in the past, and represented a clear line being drawn. No more tolerance for dysfunction, exploitation, or subversion. Leavitt made it clear that the administration does not fear political backlash or media outrage. Instead, it embraces the responsibility of taking unpopular but necessary steps. She cast the presidency not as a ceremonial position bound by political fashion, but as an active leadership role that demands courage, decisiveness, and moral clarity. The days of timid governance, she said, were over. In their place stands a leadership style that prizes action over rhetoric and results over public relations. In these closing moments, she spoke directly to the American public, urging them not to be distracted by sensational headlines or partisan narratives. She asked them to judge the administration not by noise or controversy, but by the outcomes of its actions, by safer communities, stronger borders, and a government that finally holds itself accountable. Her words were crafted to galvanize support, not just for specific policies, but for a broader political philosophy rooted in order, sovereignty, and personal responsibility. She also took a moment to underscore that the actions taken were not against immigrants, inspectors, or aid organizations per se, but against practices that erode the legal and institutional foundations of the country. Her closing argument was that compassion and fairness are not achieved through chaos, nor is transparency preserved through unaccountable oversight. True justice, she insisted, requires strength, clarity, and an unflinching commitment to principle, even when it is unpopular. As she concluded, Leavitt's tone was one of determination and moral certainty. She promised continued vigilance, further reforms, and an unwavering focus on protecting the nation's security, sovereignty, and integrity. There was no hint of compromise in her closing words, only a clear and forceful assertion that this is what leadership looks like when gloves come off and the stakes are too high to ignore.